Question 4. How did you use media technologies in the construction, research and planning and evaluation stages? I approached this question in 3 parts. Firstly looking at the research and planning, then looking at the construction, and finally looking at the evaluation of my main task as a whole, including my ancillary tasks. So, in terms of research and planning, the first piece of tech that I used was primarily YouTube for research purposes into similar short films. This was very useful for me because often short films don't get wide media releases, and so they're not available in other formats such as DVD or direct download. And so often they use YouTube as a distribution platform to easily access a wider audience without much cost involved. When it came to writing the scripts, I found a program called Celtx very useful for creating professional looking scripts very easily over the internet. Previously, in other productions, I had used simply Microsoft Word. However, I found this to be fairly limited when it came to writing long-form scripts. However, Celtx had the functions I needed to create professional-looking scripts that were easy for my actors to read and easy to edit over the internet, meaning that if I wanted to make script changes directly on set, I could do that fairly easily without much hassle for the actors because they could view the script online rather than having physical printed out copies, which will proved very helpful when we were moving between locations, such as when we moved outside to a different location later on in the production cycle. However, this was a free trial, and so the functionality was rather limited, and so it might be more useful to purchase a full membership in order to get the full functionality of this product. However, for what it was very useful in creating professional looking scripts. I also use the internet a fair bit for research and planning purposes in order to research genre theory and also audience theory in terms of my ancillary tasks and also my main task to look into the audiences for particular magazines and posters, as well as the audience for short film, which led me to discover that the audience for short film is rather niche. This also gave me access to the site Blogger, which was very useful for creating a working diary of the process and also logging all the work that I'd done over the months. However, when it came to uploading files such as PowerPoints or photos and videos, it proved less useful than I would have liked, and so maybe in future I would have used a different technology in order to provide me with a more user-friendly experience compared to Blogger. However, for what it was worth, it was very useful. However, when it came to the evaluation stages, it was somewhat more limited. Moving on to construction, the biggest change between AS and A2, I've got to say, was the change from a simple point-and-shoot camera to a large Canon camera, which is pictured here. This camera was incredibly useful as it gave me a much wider variety of options in terms of shots I could attempt and lighting conditions I could use, because often the f-stop values on the lenses that I was using, for example, the 24mm or the 50mm, were a lot lower than I could achieve with the normal point-and-shoot cameras, meaning that I could film in much lower light levels, which was especially useful during the outside shots, which I don't think I could have achieved in such detail with a normal point-and-shoot camera. The lens is also worth mentioning because I believe they added a lot to the film as a whole, because, for example, the 24mm lens was very useful when filming the opening long shot as Ottily's character Sam walks through the party, while the 50mm lens was very useful when working in mid-shot and close-up, which I did a fair bit, which might have been a flaw of my product, but I thought the way I achieved it worked well. And finally, the use of the standard lens was very useful as it allowed me to create some nice wide shots, such as the one used outside and the one used as an establishing shot for the positioning of Danny in the opening scene. Finally, for the opening shot of as Ottily's character Sam walks through the party, I used a large stabilizer rig to get a nice gliding effect to the camera movement in order to get an effective long shot take. This was very useful in creating this effect. However, it was very difficult to use and it was very time consuming to set up, which did eat into my production time. And so this could have been fixed with more training with the product, I believe. However, the actual effect it created, where I didn't get the balance quite right, and this did lead to some camera shake as I moved the camera around, I thought created a better effect than I was hoping, because rather than creating a perfectly smooth camera, I created a somewhat rough camera, which gave the illusion that it was a person physically holding it without creating too much camera shake, which led to what I believe to be a very effective shot and definitely improved the quality of my media product. So overall, I think my use of the camera was very effective, and it definitely improved my media product as a whole, as it allowed me to create a more professional looking product very easily because the camera itself was fairly portable. It was definitely heavier than I'd previously used, and this was an issue especially when it came to using tripods, because it meant I couldn't use it handheld because it was too heavy to keep up for such a long period of time. However, when it was on a tripod, it was much more useful, but this meant that I couldn't get some shots that I wanted because the tripod was somewhat clunky and meant that I couldn't position the camera exactly where I wanted it, and this did lead to a couple of problems in production, such as when I had to reshoot because I got lazy and positioned the tripod in the wrong place, causing a confusing shot reverse shot that looked odd in when I viewed it in post, and this can be seen as an issue. However, this was more due to my lack of planning skills rather than the ability of the camera. I also used a Tascam audio recorder and a Rode microphone to record my sound, as well as a boom pole. However, while this was useful in some close-up shots where I could easily disguise the position of the camera, this became an issue in wider shots, which meant that some of the wider shots where I couldn't disguise the position of the microphone were less well recorded, and so this did lead to issues such as there were in the ending of the film, which meant that there were some audio issues which I did have to fix in post, which was an issue. And in addition to this, I found that there was actually some background noise which couldn't be deleted by the recorder, and this meant that often I would just use the audio from the onboard camera in the onboard microphone in the camera, which proved to be very useful and meant that I feel like my use of these particular media technologies weren't as effective as they could have been. In terms of post-production for my main task, I primarily used Final Cut for editing of both sound and video, as well as some color correction, which was definitely necessary because when I was reshooting, I got the color balance wrong on my camera, and this meant that the shots which were filmed later on in the production cycle looked different to the ones shot earlier, and so I had to use color correction to attempt to match these as closely as possible, which I think I achieved very well and was very easy to do on Final Cut. The editing is also smooth, however the sound editing ability of the software is somewhat limited, and this did mean that when I had issues with sound, I often couldn't fix them completely and had to make do and mend. This might have been partially due to errors made in the earlier production cycle. However, I believe that if I'd had slightly stronger audio software, this could have been fixed and made to sound better, which would have improved the quality of my media product. But overall, Final Cut was a very useful piece of kit to use in editing and color grading of my main piece. For all the music in my product, I used GarageBand, which is a software which comes with Apple Mac computers. I'd initially planned to use a slightly more advanced version of this software. Well, not version of this software, but a different music creation software called Logic. But as I began to experiment on it, I found that it wasn't really necessary to create because I started to move away from a more guitar and drum based kind of soundtrack, kind of indie and rock music, and I moved towards a more electronically based soundtrack, and for the purposes of that, GarageBand was actually really useful, and I think that the soundtrack definitely adds a lot. However, then I did move away from this for the final piece, and I used a physical piano for that, and I think that was for the best, because while GarageBand is very useful when creating electronically based soundtracks, when you move towards physical instrument sounds such as pianos or guitars, the synthetic nature of the GarageBand sample sounds definitely shows through, and this could have caused issues and made the ending not as effective as I think it could have been when I used the physical object of the piano. And so I believe that while GarageBand was very useful for some soundtracks, I was right to not use it for some other soundtracks. In terms of my ancillary tasks, I primarily used Photoshop CS5, I think it was, for both of the magazine article and the poster. In terms of the poster, it was very useful for placing layers of titles and awards on top of the main image I had created, while in addition to creating the blur effect around the main two characters, which I think definitely added to the quality of the product, while with the magazine article, it was useful in comparison to something like Microsoft Word, because it allowed me much greater control over the formatting and organization of the various bits of text and image that I used as part of the magazine article. And I think this definitely made it look more professional and more sophisticated than I could have managed with using Microsoft Word. I possibly could have used Publisher in this, however, I was more experienced with Photoshop at the time, and so that is why I stuck with Photoshop, which might not have quite as good functionality, but I believe was strong enough and created two very strong ancillary tasks. In terms of evaluation, I used a mixture of media technology. So, for example, with this question and question 2, I used a Tascam audio recorder again in order to record clean audio so that it was very much audible, and so that the two tasks looked more professional. However, instead of using the large Canon cameras for question 2, I decided to use a simple point and shoot because I found this to be more efficient and quicker to achieve. In a similar way to the way that I used the point and shoot cameras when I was working with the Vox Pops, because it's a lot lighter and a lot easier to carry around and simply just go point and shoot, hence the name. And so I found it a lot easier to perform the Vox Pops for question 3 on a point and shoot camera rather than carrying around a large Canon camera. Then in terms of the other questions, I decided to keep one in a simple essay format, for which I used Microsoft Word. And I think for what it's worth, Microsoft Word does have its issues, but for creating a long form essay, such as I did in question 3, it was very useful. And then for question 1, I used Microsoft PowerPoint, which I like as it allows the splitting up of information into easily read segments, and I think that was necessary for the style that I was looking for in the kind of art of the title style. However, then I did go back to Microsoft Word for the annotation of the 2 ancillary tasks, as when I was performing my research and planning, this had proved very useful when researching similar media texts for my ancillary tasks, such as the posters and magazine articles that I researched, and annotating these was a lot easier in Word than it was in Photoshop. And while in Photoshop it could have looked better, in Word it was a lot quicker and a lot more efficient. And when the focus is primarily on the text itself rather than on the display, which could have been slightly better in Photoshop, I believe that Word was the right choice to go for when creating these ancillary tasks. Evaluation.